much in front. Hello, you recording? Yeah.
Cool. All right. Let's begin with bow. Welcome. Welcome. And Miriam and Kelly Sue, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. So in the first, so last week we got an agreement that it's okay to record it because I'm recording it in order to get a portfolio together to be a peer-reviewed ACT trainer. If you guys aren't cool with that, let me know.
I am cool with that, Brooks.
Cool with that, awesome. And last week we covered really functional contextualism, which is a big compound, it's not a word, it's a compound phrase, I don't know. It's pointing to the philosophical ground that ACT stands on. And we sort of got into why that's important, and really the big takeaway here is that ACT, we don't argue ontology with people. We don't argue about what people are and what people aren't, or fight with their thoughts about who they are or aren't. We're constantly seeking to return to this question of workability and how helpful is it to engage in those conversations. Often what we'll find is that people are engaging in a tug of war between sort of, am I a good person or am I a bad person? Am I a worthy person or am I a shameful wretch? And it's like, depending on what cues are in their environment or their recent historical context, they're going to come out on one side of that fence or the other. And it doesn't really provide a sort of a lasting ground that they can return to that provides a sort of durable, flexible reference for a sense of self that will support effective action. Does that make sense? It's like, yeah, it's like, I don't feel like going to my job today. It's like, yeah, it's a lot easier to go to your job when you feel like motivated and the stars are aligned such that you're like, yeah! I'm gonna be the best Target checkout person ever! You know? Better than Kristen Wiig, if you've seen that character. And it's like, what happens when you don't? And like the night before you got into a fight and like you realize that you bounced a few checks and you broke and you're like, got that whole failure narrative and you're on the unworthy side and everything feels heavy and hard, right? It's like, if our metric of assessing whether or not we're going to do something is based on sort of how we feel in the moment, if that's our sole metric, then usually what's going to happen is that we're going to be very unpredictable. And the choices that we're making are going to be really based on sort of a short-term, a near horizon. And so our ability to actually take effective action in the long term and weather the challenges and storms of internal distress that show up along the way is going to be minimal. And so ACT is very much interested in this question of how do we help people live a full, rich, meaningful life. And it's less interested in how do we help people feel better in the short term. How do we get rid of distress just for that sake? It's fine. It's awesome to align with people's desire to get rid of their pain and their stress, and it can be a very damaging message to hold back, to withhold a sense of compassion and joining in that wish as sort of this like, I know, wouldn't it be nice to get rid of all this stuff? But it's not what we're doing. So let's so there's this real dance of completely validating a client, like a human being, in our very reasonable, natural desire to live free of pain. suffering. To join with that, while also at the same time opening to a deeper question of what is this suffering in service of? What does this suffering tell us about what you care about? And holding in mind a real sort of grounded sense that like, yeah, I know, I wish we could live without this pain too. And if we could, life would be a lot easier. And here's what we've got. So how do we work with what we've got, given where you want to go? Does that make sense? So ACT is rooted in a behavioral analytic tradition, and so hence that that article on functional analysis. And what we're going to go through today is we're going to pretty much try to race through the 6 core processes in the model called the hexaflex. It's the hexagram of flexibility. That was my one Steve Hayes voice of the day. So we're going to go through that, and really I see the hexaflex as a model of identifying what are sort of 6 helpful processes to assess, knowing that these processes are incredibly adaptive in terms of developing what we call psychological flexibility, which we went over the definition of that, and we'll do that again. So again, remember, this is another theoretical session, so it's a little talking head a bit, and we're going to run through this. We did that last time, right? If you don't know where you're going, you may never get there. I love this quote, in large part because, right, without a definition of mental health, without an understanding of our own sense of like, what are we shooting for? I don't know. We'll go there when everybody's feeling good for the short term, is that right? We actually have to build a sort of an idiopathic understanding, like so a metric of success that's grounded in the particulars of a client's value set and learning history. Does that make sense? Because the value set is going to define where the heck what is the measure of success? Well, it's whether you can make contact with the present moment more fully as a conscious human being and change behavior or persistent behavior when doing so serves valued ends. So it's when doing so serves valued ends, we need to really understand and have a deep sort of alliance with what that person is really longing for, deeply, truly yearning for in their life. Not what they're really wishing would go away, but what they actually, if that were to go away, then what would they be doing next? That sort of miracle question. Right? Blah, 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 we've done this. Blah, blah, blah. Kind of more fully as a conscious human being. I did all right. Yeah? Did okay. Okay, so drilling into the actual model of ACT, we can sort of look at 3 pillars of the 6 processes. Right? You see how clean that is? So open is referring really to the, I would say, some of the psychological skills of how we relate to our own experience, our thoughts and feelings. Are we open to thoughts being being conditioned by our past learning, part of a relational web of associations that is sort of unique to our learning history, and to see that our mind throws forward cognitions, assessments, evaluations, judgments as sort of just a natural phenomenon of what it does. Is it, oh, that's related to this, and that's related to this. However, arbitrarily. Right? We went over arbitrary, little RFT last time, right? Relating anything to anything. Okay, we did. Never mind. We'll do that later. Okay, so open, are we open to our experience as it is? Not as what it says it is, right? Centered or aware. So centered is, this piece points to what is sometimes referred to as a spiritual axis of the ACT processes, which is really sort of the ground of our experience, the ground of the phenomena that we contact, which is contact with the present moment and connected with a sense of self as, it's called self as context in this model, but it's a sense of self that is not a thing in and of itself, but a space in which our experience arises and falls away into. If you've had experience with meditation, you've contacted this sense of witness, this sense of abiding presence. Does that make sense? And then engaged. And then this is really the sort of out in the world, are you able to take steps that serve your valued ends out in the world? Right? So this would be sort of like inner behavior, outer behavior, and the context in which all behavior exists. Yeah. Cool. And then what that looks like on the hexaflex, which is really sort of like, if you know anything about ACT, this would be the sort of, oh, it's a hexaflex, it's those 6 things, right? And it's like, yeah. Ah, the 6 things. Entail, right? The 6 things entail 12, actually, because you have 6 processes of psychological flexibility, and on the flip side of each of those, you would be assessing, you know, dysfunction or impaired or rigid behaviors. So, on the open side, you have acceptance and willingness and diffusion, and sort of somewhat arbitrarily, acceptance and willingness tends to relate to the feeling state. Are you willing to have this experience as it is? And diffusion is, are you able to see your thoughts as thoughts, not as broadcasts of truth, right? Not as accurate forecasters of doom, not as completely accurate evaluator of worth. And then on the center, you have contact with here and now, and then you have observer self down here, or self as context. And on the engaged, you have clarity and contact with values, and then committed action in service of those values. Right. And so later on in our class, I'll present you some sheets that are actual assessment sheets that you can do with a client to assess sort of have them assess where they are in each of these scales, which is a great opportunity to begin to engage this model very explicitly with people that you work with. And develop a contract with them. And also, one of the things we do as ACT therapists is we're listening in our own sort of in private assessment. We're listening for sort of where do we see help this client sort of resourced and engaging flexibly in terms of these 6 processes, and where do we see them really stuck? And so we can identify sort of where we might target our clinical focus. Right. And you might start to see, like, these are not discrete things. Like, ACT theorists are the first to say, these don't exist. These are arbitrary categories that help us discriminate classes of behavior that are on a spectrum and that are in a complex field, so that, you know, I don't know how you can be so preoccupied with the past and the future if you're not fused with the content and struggling with some sort of rigid self-concept. And usually, if you're so preoccupied with the past or the future, you're not willing to have your experience as it is. And so these are not like they're sort of real concrete things that are divisible from each other. Make sense? All right, so let's dive in. Are there any questions at this point? No? So let's dive in to diffusion, right?
I used to think that the brain was the most wonderful organ in my body. Then I realized who was telling me this.
That was on the radio this morning when I was driving in.
This
Oh,
quote?
that's fantastic.
Are you serious?
Yeah. Yeah, Emo Phillips.
How did I do? With Emo
Pretty
Phillips?
good. Pretty good.
Yeah?
Yeah, he's
He's an interesting cat.
very interesting.
Nice. I'm glad that Emo
Yeah.
was on the radio with this
Yeah.
one. Yeah. I just love this quote, right? Because it just kind of flips on its head these assumptions that we walk around with all the time. But so if I were to ask you, where do you generally experience the sort of the center of yourself? Like, where would you say in your body is housed the sort of seat of yourself from which you experience the world most often? Does it make sense? Like, where would you point to? I point to here, the center of my head. There's occasionally down here, but it takes work for me to stay down here. Anyone else? Similar head? Yeah, somewhere up in here. Yeah.
There's also, and then there's also kind of a gut thing for me too that comes
Yeah.
through.
But typically, people also kind of feel like, so if you were to sort of take a seat in your where you experience the world from, you'll be somewhere at the top of your head.
Aries.
Yeah, it does. And yeah, I mean, there's a study that somewhere like upper 80% of the people that were studied, and this is in America, sort of situated somewhere in here, right? And so there's a typical experience of self that is paired with this sort of brain, mind, cognitive features, sort of where that exists, right? And so what I like about this quote is it kind of flips on its head this sense, this assumption of self, that like we're listening all the time to messages that our brain gives us, right? And it's like we're the audience, and because it's arising within us, we assume also that we're the speaker, and that speaker is somewhat intentional or has certain that we can sort of point to certain intention to it in some way, that it has a weight of truth in a way because it's arising from within us. It's like, oh, I had this thought. That thought somehow reflects me. Is that foreign to anyone? The sense of right, so I might stub my toe, and right then my mind might give me, "You're such a clumsy idiot. Pay attention." Right? And I'm like, oh. Right? It's like, and I'm definitely the audience in that moment. And there's definitely a stimulus of aggression, right? And so it's like there's this weird thing that happens when in our relationship with our own mind, that we sort of attribute selfness to it, right? And so what I like about this is that Emo Phillips sort of stands outside of that. He's like, wait a second, mind. Hold on. Is that really how I feel? Is that really a choice for me if I were to sort of have choice about which messages that I would want aligned with a sense of self that are in terms of, that might be more helpful to me? If I'm really valuing compassion, that first, "You're such an idiot, pay attention," it's like, wow, that may not be the thought that I would most want to attend to cultivate compassion, right? But it's there. It's bumping around in my junk drawer of my mind, because somewhere along the line, my mind picked it up as a natural response to doing something clumsy. Maybe somebody said that to me. Maybe I saw it happen on movies a bunch, and I internalized it, right? It's there. It's just ready to be used in a proper moment, and that was a proper moment. You gonna say something?
Well, I was just gonna say, the other thing about that is I'm just aware that it's very easy to relate to that as true when it's just so consistently there. I mean, it's just like a really human thing to relate that as true. And I think that until you start to kind of have a different view, you would never question the truth of that. And that's where we get really stuck.
Yeah.
So, you know, what I love about this is it also says like, wow, you know, maybe this is like propaganda that, you know,
Right.
you don't
You
actually have
exactly.
to, it's optional to how you want to relate with it.
Yeah. I just got a thing on my computer that needs to go away. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, there's this piece of like, you know, what's familiar becomes true. It's like, oh, yeah, okay. And we start to question it less and less the more it's in the stream. And so there's so many messages of the mind that have been unexamined. And so they're taken as de facto truths. Okay, so that was something to talk about. Cognitive fusion is really what we were just discussing, is this sense of just, that is, sorry.
Stop. Finish, no.
It's like I'm relating to these computers as like a disobedient dog. So fusion is really just, well, you can imagine, the thought shows up and one's self, a sense of self, is fused with that message. That message is just taken at face value as truth, right? Diffusion is a stance of seeing a thought as a thought. It's like, so it's moving from, I'm such an idiot. God, I'm such an idiot. I can't believe I said that. Fusion. It's like, I'm having the thought that I'm an idiot. My mind is giving me that idiot story. Diffusion. Right? So, and this is something that we work with from an ACT stance that we're working with all the time. As part of our language customs with clients, we adopt this place, not just like, so what do you think about that? If there's sort of like, if we're sort of preparing the client, we're seeing the client begin to recount a story that historically we would imagine there's a lot of judgment. We might refrain from saying, what do you think about that? To something more flexible, it's like, so what do you see your mind telling you about that? What is your mind making of that? Right? And so this is part of our language customs over and over and over again. Right? Because like, what's familiar becomes true. And so we start to become, and like Jill was saying, that we become the sort of, the higher cortical functions of our clients as they're sort of developing into it. They begin to internalize our voice as perhaps a more wise, or more neutral observer of their behavior. And so we should be modeling customs and practices that would help them to adopt that stance themselves. Right? So like, what do you see your mind giving you about that? Okay. Are there any other messages that your mind is giving you? Are there any other messages that that from this place of really longing for connection and compassion that you might generate, that might be sort of, we could also put on the table then? And then so now if we have these 4 messages that are on the table in response to this one being your mom, clearly, this one being a result from the sort of experience that you've had being bullied on the playground, and then this one coming from this 23-year-old self who's looking at this and saying, I want a new tool here. Which one would you choose to pick up? Right? So we're not arguing with any of the messages that have come up from the past. We're laying them out before and then presenting that there's a choice to be made in how we relate to all the messages, and that we can actually self-generate new frames of meaning, new frames of reference to these situations that have historic associations with them that elicit incredibly painful thoughts and feelings. And it's weird and awkward, and it feels like fake, because the new messages don't have the same weight of feelings associated with them. They don't conjure up the same sort of matrix of feeling, thought, memory, impulse. They're much more neutral. Does that make sense? So it's like, okay, yeah. And you've still got all those old feelings that are showing up with those messages. They're still here. So I'm not saying push them away, because you can't. If you could, this would have been solved years ago. But the problem is the more you push, the more they're there. So we're just going to establish this new frame and see how it works. What if that were true? Because again, we're not arguing truth. We're arguing flexibility and workability based on one's values. And so much of this can start with the relationship that they begin to cultivate with themselves, which you are a model for what would a new relationship look like with myself that's based on unconditional positive regard, acceptance, warmth, compassion, curiosity, as opposed to scrutiny. Like, we are modeling that new relationship to themselves. Sure.
Sort of a random question, but do they use ACT with kids?
They do use it. They do use ACT with kids.
Those
Yeah.
people?
Yeah, Louise McHugh and Lisa Coyne have done a lot of work. Louise McHugh more with adolescents,
Mhm.
Lisa Coyne more with kids and families and parents. And then there's a lot of work being done, not with the ACT model specifically, but with a lot of work with RFT,
Mhm.
with autism spectrum disorders, and the perspective taking being a huge piece that they're seeing that you can, with training perspective taking intensively, you can actually build IQ. Like, IQ tests are sensitive to perspective taking training, as well as empathy and reading social cues. So I can give you some resources. You're on the ACBS thing, right?
I didn't get expired.
Okay.
Should go back on it.
Public shaming right
That's
there.
right. I didn't pay my dues.
You let your membership lapse.
That's right.
Yeah, did you want to go further with that?
I mean, I was just thinking, I've just never thought about it before, because so many of these, how I relate to these concepts are very, I feel like in some ways sort of advanced, you know, they kind of, in that they like require these like years of relating to the mind in a certain way, and then beginning to kind of peel that back. You know, and then I was like, well, you know, I'm sure kids have values, and, you know, like, just sort of, I've just never thought about like taking the perspective of like a 10-year-old or something and applying these concepts, and I just didn't know what ACT was doing with those.
Yeah. I mean, play therapy is so good for this, right? I mean, it's just like, you can do all sorts of work with perspective taking, with training up a values repertoire, and really doing a lot with just sort of how you speak with a kid. That I'm learning actually with my kid and parenting in a way that is really, you know, working very naturally to adopt customs where I'm attributing sort of selfing behaviors to more choiceful things, and rather than sort of like labeling him a certain way, like, oh, it looks like, you know, you're crying, it looks like you're feeling some pain right now, as opposed to like, oh, you're I don't know, what, you're really hurt, or like life's shit, or like I'm seeing this, like, I would try to refrain from being like, oh, you're such a good boy, right? To instead shifting it to reinforcing actions. I'm like, wow, Farron, I really appreciate that you listened to me there and you stepped away from the dog's bowl, right? Like, I really appreciate that. And just taking more responsibility for my thing rather than just sort of like trying to get him to relate to himself as a frame of like, I'm good or bad. But rather it's like, wow, this was helpful for Dad, and so it generally makes things go better. So there's a lot to be done just in the sort of customs that we adopt, and there's a lot of great work to be done with play. There's art
Music.
therapy, ACT groups. There's protocol for those.
Is there any music therapy ACT groups? Because in the Happiness Trap, they talk about like this concept of like singing your like laying out, like taking that inventory,
Yeah.
and like singing them in like a goofy tune,
Mhm.
like, which I found to be really effective for me personally. But when I try to use it with clients, it can be, it can be kind of corny, basically.
You gotta model corny.
Yeah, you have to. Yeah, you have to be comfortable with the
Yeah.
corniness of it.
Yeah, totally. I haven't seen protocol for a music
See,
group,
that's
so
why
that's on you to
that's
write.
me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. That's cool. It's good to know where the opportunities
So
are.
get it going. And
Yeah.
we'll put it up on CBS. Cool. So let's go in. So the basic rule of thumb here for cognitive diffusion is actually a bumper sticker I saw on my way into work today.
Sweetness.
Yeah. So it's all coming together, y'all. Don't believe everything you think. Simple as that, right? There's a lot of stuff in our mind from our learning history that. Anybody ever have a really horrible song get stuck in your head and it just blares?
It's all coming together.
Right? And you're just like, oh my God, like our thoughts are like that, right? That we get a lot of thoughts stuck in our head that we would not choose to have, and yet they're in us. And they've gotten in there through some sort of repetition, usually coded with some emotionally heightened event where we're very susceptible to coding then memories that are pretty deep and integrated in our nervous system because it's adaptive to pay attention to threats, right? And so that thought then becomes a threat cue, and we become very sensitive to it, to no fault of our own, right?
And I like to, definitely talk up because there's so much kind of shaming that can happen as adults and stuff. It also was maybe a really viable option. It probably served a purpose, at some point. And that's a really huge thing because a lot of these are pre-verbal, where these origins are. So really kind of normalizing, like this was, you're an asshole for doing this. Like, I just want to be able to say, like, it's kind of an optional. You get to step back and really be more empowered in how you're going to relate with these things.
Yeah.
It's not cause and it's not confirmation, and just getting out of that whole cycle. It's kind of liberating, and you can do it in a way that you don't feel like, oh, why do I keep doing this? It's like, well, you did it for a good reason at a certain point.
Yeah, and in our word prisons talk, if you've seen that recently, we talk about rules and the rules that we've adopted that have just served us usually in our homes of origin, our families of origin, or in early situations, school settings, early social situations. We inferred rules based on what was reinforced and what was more likely punished in some ways, right? And they served us. They were adaptive. They kept us in a place that was, shielded from as much pain as we could shield from. And the problems with our rules is that it's very difficult to step out of those rules that were laid very early on, particularly because if what we do is going to elicit the anger of our primary caregiver, that's actually a mortal threat.
Mm-hmm.
That actually is a threat to our life and limb. So we need to be really careful around that. And so that stuff gets laid in the sort of foundation of how we make sense of and interpret meaning of a world around us, sensitive to any cues that might elicit or might indicate there's a threat nearby, whether that's a raised eyebrow, whether that's a tone of voice, whether that's not responding to a question. That old rule can show up, and this is very same processes as a trauma response. Right? It's the intelligence of how do we navigate a very dangerous world where our survival is dependent on staying in the good graces of a community. We're going all over the place here. This is nice. Okay, so some elements of cognitive fusion. So this is sort of like, this is RFT, rough and ready, really quick. So relations between mental events and stimuli are arbitrary, yet related to as if they are real. Steve? Yes? Yeah, everybody here has done word prisons? Yeah? Okay. So, right, give me a noun.
Dog.
Give me a noun.
Mug.
Okay, if you said tomato, I'd be like,
Yeah, I was like, that it's all coming together then, because that's what the parents
Yeah.
said.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Dog and tomato.
no, they
Yeah.
took dog and tomato, yeah.
Because you said dog and mug.
Yeah, dog and mug. All right, so like, how is the dog the father of the mug? There's no wrong answer here. How is a dog a father of the mug?
That's a tough one. That's really a tough one.
Yeah, it is a tough one.
Well-
Humans needed to pet the dog while drinking water, so they created handles on their glasses so they could use it
Yeah.
one-handed.
Nice.
Or
Great.
you wake up with the dog in the morning to go for a walk, and then you come back and you have your coffee.
So the dog precedes
The dog
mug.
precedes.
in that
Dog
experience.
gets you
Right.
up
Right.
to your mug.
I've got a book at home called Pug Mugs, and it's
There you
like
go.
mugshots of pugs.
Pug mugs.
Right?
Totally.
And so it's like without the dog, there would be no pug mug, and so pug is a right. So the dog is the father of the mug. Is there, right? So it's like we just created a relationship through a number of different relationships, through a number of different creative, very creative pathways to answer this question: how's the dog the father of the mug? Right? Anybody ever have that quick thought in their head that the dog is the father of the mug? Yes. No, nobody's ever.
Kind
had that
of.
thought.
Over
You
last
might
weekend,
have
I
that
kind of
thought
did.
down
Yeah.
the road. You might see a dog later today or sometime this week and be like, "Mugs, that's silly," right? But that thought would show up in your mind. It's additive, right? So, and we just created relationships that are totally arbitrary, based on learning history. Like, somebody has a dog that they sleep with. I do. Somebody has a book that has pug mugs, and right? It's like arbitrary learning history helps us to create creative relationships where none formally exist. Okay, that's one of the powers of language. And then we relate to it as if it's real, right? Like, do I need to do the saliva exercise again? Everybody remembers
We're
that?
good.
Never.
We're all
Right?
set.
Everybody remembers the saliva exercise. We relate to these things as if they're real, all happening in here through our web of associations, right? And then the thought shows up, or that conceptual stimulus shows up, and it actually elicits a feeling. And that's the wizardry of thinking right there. That gives the illusion of reality. It's because my thought triggers a feeling, and therefore it is real. I'm relating to it, so it's real. Right? Okay. So relationships are additive. Once learned, they're in there. You're going to see a little pug, and you're going to think of a coffee mug, and boom, and then all of a sudden it's there, right? It's additive. We can't get that out of you again. You might forget it, but at some point, you might actually see the book Pug Mugs and think of that thought again. And it's there, right? So we can't actually eradicate thoughts. We can't go in and just take that thought away. And this is where ACT makes a radical departure from traditional CBT. There's no such thing as thought replacement. We're creating a new association to the dysfunctional thought. So hopefully that relationship, when the dysfunctional thought arises, so too also will that be an opportunity for that new thought to arise. And so this is what some of the things that we do in therapy is that we're trying to shape and strengthen those new, more functional associations. Right? And so our voice might show up when they're having a panic attack, if we're lucky enough for our clients to have a panic attack with us in the room. Because then we can actually be there with them, holding a place of acceptance, as opposed to sort of searching our office for a workbook to make the panic go away, which is not very helpful. So, long and the short, cognitive fusion is buying what your mind tells you, which often leads to rigid maladaptive responding. Not always, but often, right? So sometimes I'll say So if right now I might sort of have a part of our sort of language customs, a sort of metaphor of buying your thoughts, right? And I'm like, so if you bought that thought, would it be a good investment for you? Right? You keep paying for that thought, and yet it seems like it just leaves you broke and destitute again and again. How long do you want to pay for that thought? Right? We're buying our thoughts. What would happen if we had a different transaction here? If when this thought shows up, you recognize it, you're like, oh wait, I do that all the time. I want to see what's behind the case. I want to see what's in the back room, right? We start to sort of create new associations, new relationships to this old stimulus, right? And this is where metaphors are a very integral part of this work, is that we start to sort of, we can help clients sort of take their situation that they see through this very sort of fused lens. And if we can sort of shape it into a metaphor, like, it sounds like you're buying your thought. Like, that's a metaphor, right? Nobody's pulling out their wallet when their shame trigger is elicited. Although, actually, Madison Avenue has made a great business of that, eliciting shame triggers so you pull out your wallet. But in our therapy session, we might say, you're buying your thought, right? So if this thought were a product, were a commodity, what would it be? Be a lump of shit? Would it be like a high interest credit card that requires that you pay money up front in order to get it? Or what would it be, right? And we may know something about the client's history and values that we could then sort of tailor and shape a metaphor that starts to open up their thinking, starts to create new associations and new relationships. That, like, oh wow, this thought, my relationship to this thought is actually a transaction that I'm complicit in. It's not just something that happens to me. There's something that I'm doing that I'm not even aware of, right? Okay, so then you might be like, and now I want you to reach for your wallet, but now don't get it. Then we can start just doing weird, silly things that are trying to sort of open up and expand the association so that, one, it increases awareness, so that when that thought shows up, there might be an association with a goofy exercise that I did in therapy. Like, oh, it's silly. I don't get broochies. But all of a sudden, you've shifted the focus. If you can have the thought that I'm an idiot while being in a shame response, you've interrupted a very automatic path of behavior that they've engaged in again and again and again. You've inserted something new, like you put a little penny on the track and there was a little blip. But that little blip is like, that's something. You're starting to open up in the opportunities for more choice, because you're beginning to develop more awareness. Making sense? Okay. Oh, diffusion is seeing thoughts as thoughts, not as broadcasts of truth. I don't think we need any more. Okay. 3 stages of self-awareness. Right? This is sort of early childhood shaping. No, I'm not. What if I am? Right? Okay. So these processes, I mean, they're real. Like, we talk about them as if, they're sort of these gimmicks or tricks. It's not. Cognitive fusion is real pain. And if we're not willing to respect that, then we run the risk of really objectifying our clients and becoming another stimulus that reinforces their own unworthiness in some way, or whatever it might be. We have to respect their pain is real. Right? Don't think that thought. It's not that. All right, automatic verbal responding. So just first person to respond, just yell out first thing that comes to mind for you. Be honest. Mary had a little. Eeny, meeny, miny.
Oh.
There's no place like.
Oh.
When did you learn that? You guys are so good. Like, have you guys been training in this? No? Yeah? Yeah? You dusted off the old books? Yeah. Can anybody tell me the sort of the day that they learned one of these things? You sit down and studied it, took it in, no? Has anybody sort of like consciously given thought to these sayings in the last year? Raise your hand. I have. I do this. Last 3 years? No. And yet they're right there, right? Given the right cue, it just shows up. It's there. You don't need to work at it. It's just in you. And it doesn't feel like you've learned it because they're just sort of in the water that you grew up in. You can't name when you learned it, right? And so much of our automatic repertoires, of sort of a cue of getting a D minus. That's a cue for an automatic repertoire of responding. It doesn't feel like it's learned. It feels like it's there. Right? I'm not really a good person. I'm so sad I think I will just. I can't believe I said that. I'm such a. That's mine. Right? So just given the right cue, and we can feel like the weight and just, we relate to these as if they're real. Because in our history, they've attached themselves to a whole complex of feelings, impulses, associations, and memories. Okay. So I think I've talked about quite a bit of these. Various ways to strengthen diffusion, right? So like distinguish between who one is and what your minds do. That's huge. I say that all the time to people. I'm like, you are more than what your mind does, right? And you actually aren't solely what your mind does. So really normalize these verbal processes, these cognitive processes. Just being like, this is what your mind learned how to do. Right? So what does your mind tell you about that, right? Blah, 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 blah. Teach, and then formal mindfulness skills. Really helping people to distinguish experientially a sense of awareness, a sense of self, a you that has been you this whole time. And then you're actually able to see thoughts that show up within you. That move is like, there's a you seeing the thought, as opposed to like, you thought, right? That's a huge move. And that's the beginning, like when clients start to say, I'm aware that this is a thought. Like, holy smokes, big time. The first time they're like, I see that thought. Wow, that's epic, right? Because that's the beginning of what could be a real major game changer in terms of sort of the relationship that they have with their own mind.
Yeah, so would you say that like not even being aware that a thought is there could be being very diffused with it?
Could be being very diffused?
Or fused with it, sorry.
Yes.
Like,
I would say that one of the more challenging things that we have to do as therapists and as these helping professionals is to bring forward the underlying, the unconscious rules that a client is following that are maintaining a stuck pattern. Right? So somebody asked me, when was that? Oh, that was at the parent workshop. It was, do you think awareness is sufficient grounds for change? And I was like, no. I'd say it's necessary, but not always sufficient. Sometimes it's all you need is to be aware of it, and then all of a sudden they can self-organize because they can bring skills to bear that they already have once they're aware of what they're addressing, the underlying thoughts, right? But like, there's all sorts of rules that I'm responding to before I'm even aware of responding to them because they're so ingrained, they're so automatic, that it takes deep intimacy to access them, or it needs to get really out of control for it to get big enough for me to sort of like, for it to have texture that I can actually see it as a rule, or as something that I'm doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and
It can
that's
be
the
so
process
subtle.
of becoming mindful of it.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a process of engaging in intimate relationships that elicit our vulnerabilities, that bring this forward. And this is really like, I'm sort of moving into some FAP territory here, the functional analytics psychotherapy, but it's just sort of how I'm moving personally. So when we relate to our clients, it's one of the things that our clients struggle with, we can say, is for the most part, we're all struggling in relationship. That like our problems with our work, relationship problems, our problems with our self-esteem, relationship problems. Like, you know, this huge, it was a 70-year study from Harvard where they followed, I think it was like 300 undergrad Harvard students beginning in like 1948 or 49. And the study just finished up, I think 3 years ago, because I think the last person died. So 70-year study, longitudinally followed like around 300 people, checking in like I think every few years. All sorts of life status stuff, demographic info, all sorts of assessments of quality of life. The single sole factor that was highly correlated with quality of life, it had nothing to do with status, wealth, job. It was all about quality of their relationships. It was the highest individual correlate to happiness. And so, where am I going? So, we're being contracted to help people suffer less, to help people engage in meaningful lives. In order to do that, we actually have to be willing to step into real vulnerability in order to develop and reinforce a relationship that is meaningful, that is valuable, where one is reinforced for courage, and where the habitual tendencies that are maladaptive and rigid are not reinforced, but are actually sort of brought forward and identified as being such, right? And the more that we can do that, to develop those types of relationships that are really deeply loving. And that's not just something like, oh, I know how to love people. It's like, I need to learn how to love you. I need to learn how to love you. I need to learn how to love you, right? Like learning how to love one person does not mean you know how to love a person who shows up with a very different history. So it's through that, I believe, that those more deeply unconscious stuff, we can call them attachment wounds and whatnot, they're going to start showing up more and more. The more vulnerable, the more connected, the more risky our relationships are. And I say risky in the sense that like there's actually the felt sense of safety and trust in order to take those risks. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
They start to show up more. They get a little squirmy actually. It's like, oh, I feel really seen. Okay, how do I relax with that? Make sense? Yes, mindfulness. Cool, and then these goofy ACT practices, right? So teaching and practicing skills to deliteralize language and transforming stimulus function.
Oh, that's number two.
Number two. So, milk, 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 cartoon voices, words on screen, speaking slowly, fast in a song, etc. This is where you can get really creative and play, right? So, I have to be honest, like, this is not like a standard part of my repertoire. It's definitely in my repertoire with clients, but it's not something I get to do sort of all the time. That being said, here's a different shift that I had to make from my Naropa training to being more of an ACT therapist, is that there's a lot more psychoed. We're very explicit in ACT about the work that we're doing in a way that I've found, like, my training in contemplative psych to be much more subtle and much more really following the lead of the client, and I didn't really have a sense of sort of like what creating a solid therapeutic contract looked like in a contemplative view. And then I came into ACT, and it's like, oh, I need to really establish a solid therapeutic contract that's based on client values, that is not in agreement with the client to lower their anxiety or lower their depression, but that's actually, the contract is about helping them to live more fully and richly with what they've got. And we'll see how it changes over time, but that's right. But not to be complicit in an agenda of decreasing symptoms. Instead, in being very explicit in an agreement to increase functioning, and to increase our contact with value, activities, and meaning, and purpose. And that really begins in the therapeutic relationship. How do we actually increase a sense of meaning and purpose in relationship here and now? So, it often requires quite a bit of psychoed about these kinds of, normalizing these functions of mind, right? Everybody remember the polygraph and gun metaphor? Right? Yeah, right? The less you want it, the more you've got it, right? These kinds of sort of, these kinds of metaphors and exercises help to make explicit processes of control that are not actually helpful when what we're looking for is more flexibility. So, I might use these exercises in that sort of psychoed period, psychoed phase, to help people see sort of these processes of mind. And also, actually, the diffusion stuff is like working with a client's fused content. I might come back to the psychoed and look at it through that lens of fusion and say, hey, would you be willing to do some work with this message of like, I'm a loser, right? And then we've actually gotten back. It can help us out quite a bit already. So, anybody have? Are there any of these that are sort of foreign to people, or that you're like, what the heck's that? These exercises. Milk, milk, milk. All right. Okay, so I would use milk, milk, milk as sort of like, that's a sort of classic, I think, psychoed piece for me, how I use it. And really on the front end, looking at sort of like how we relate to our thoughts as if they're real, and how when I have a thought, there's so much associated material and content of my own learning history that comes forward with that simple thought, right? Like, I can say the word milk, right? And you guys might imagine, it's hard to do in Boulder because people don't really drink milk.
Almond milk.
What's that?
Almond milk.
Okay. All right, so imagine a type of milk that you find appetitive, you enjoy. And you might imagine that it's sort of like a warm day and you're just coming in and there's this beautiful glass of milk on the counter, and it's just like a little bit of perspiration on the glass, right? And you can just sort of imagine, like, you can probably remember what it tastes like and kind of even have a memory of that, have a feel of it in your mouth. It's sort of like kind of like a cool, somewhat viscous, right? It's sort of a creamy texture. It kind of coats your mouth. But all this stuff can show up with just saying the word milk. You know, and we're sort of magnifying it, but it's all there. It's all associated, right? And all of that stuff kind of foregrounds, actually. There's a whole lot of stuff that also shows up that we're not attending to, right? And to sort of highlight this, we'll do this. You guys willing to do this little goofy exercise? Okay. So what we're going to do is we're just going to say milk again and again and again, over and over and over again, about 30, 45 seconds or so, I'll tell you when to stop.